The hall fell into a reverent hush as the senator approached the podium, his polished shoes striking the marble floor with the rhythm of certainty. Families of the fallen filled the rows, their eyes reflecting both grief and quiet pride. Children fidgeted beside veterans whose shoulders carried the weight of memory. For many in attendance, this was meant to be another formal ceremony, another speech of gratitude, another symbolic gesture wrapped in applause. Yet beneath the grand flags that draped the hall, one man's silence carried more weight than the senator's words ever could. The tomb guard had been trained to remain invisible. His role was not to address crowds or to engage in politics, but to embody respect through unwavering stillness. He had stood through storms without shifting an inch, through blazing summers without wiping sweat, through winters that gnawed at his bones without complaint. Every step he took on the marble was not his own, but borrowed from those who could no longer walk. His oath was silence. His duty was presence. His life was sacrifice. Yet as the senator unfolded his prepared remarks, something within the guard stirred uneasily. The opening lines were familiar praise for service, acknowledgments of sacrifice, promises of unity. But then, a phrase slipped into the speech that cut across his chest like a blade. It reduced the cost of war to a metaphor, turning human loss into rhetorical flourish. To many, it might have sounded harmless, a polished phrase written to inspire. But to those who had buried loved ones beneath folded flags, it was careless. To the guard, it was dishonor dressed as dignity. He shifted his grip on the rifle, the polished wood suddenly heavy. Protocol demanded he remain frozen. His entire identity as a sentinel of silence relied on that immobility. If he moved, he would break not only regulation, but the sacred trust between himself and the thousands of guards who had stood before him. And yet, as he scanned the front row, his eyes met a mother clutching the framed photograph of her son. Her knuckles whitened as she pressed the frame against her chest, and her lips trembled at the senator's words. He remembered her face from the funeral, remembered the way her shoulders shook as taps played. The phrase the senator had spoken was not abstract to her. It was her pain being dressed up as spectacle. His chest tightened. Silence here would not protect her. Silence would not honor the fallen. Silence in this moment would wound more deeply than words. But doubt rose like a wall. If he acted, he would become the story. The fallen would be forgotten in the shadow of his disobedience. People would not remember the names etched into stone. They would remember the guard who moved. He closed his eyes for a breath, the weight of generations pressing down upon him. Marble beneath his boots seemed to whisper, reminding him of centuries of tradition. Was it arrogance to think he knew better than those who had written the code of silence? Was it pride to believe his conscience outweighed command? The senator continued, voice rich with authority, words polished to a gleam. Each sentence, however, drifted further from reverence. What was meant as tribute felt like appropriation. Applause rippled through part of the hall, polite and distracted, but the veterans shifted in their seats, unsettled. Children asked their parents in hushed tones why the man in uniform looked so tense. Cameras flashed, catching his rigid stance, the tightening of his jaw, the subtle tremor in his hands. Inside, his thoughts collided like thunder. He had promised himself he would never speak during duty. He had practiced standing still until his muscles burned, until sweat blurred his vision, until hours became indistinguishable from days. But this was different. This was not about his endurance, it was about theirs. The endurance of mothers who carried absence like a second skin. The endurance of fathers who saluted coffins draped in flags. The endurance of children who would grow up with stories instead of embraces. If protocol demanded silence in the face of their dishonor, then protocol had failed them. The guard's eyes locked on the senator, who leaned forward, voice swelling with confidence. Each syllable now sounded like a drumbeat against memory, rewriting sacrifice as political theater. He could not let those words become truth. Not here. Not in this sacred space. A choice carved itself into his heart. Remain the silent sentinel he was trained to be, or become the voice the fallen no longer had. The marble floor echoed with the senator's footsteps as he adjusted his stance. The crowd shifted, unaware of the storm brewing within the man who had stood motionless through countless ceremonies. Every instinct screamed to remain still, to vanish into the background as he always had. But then his gaze returned to the mother in the front row, tears brimming at the corners of her eyes. In that single moment, her grief outweighed every protocol. Her pain demanded action, and her son's silence demanded a voice. The decision cracked inside him like lightning. He straightened his spine, not in the practiced posture of a guard, but in defiance of the role itself. His boots struck the marble once, a sound sharp enough to ripple through the hushed crowd. Heads turned, cameras swung. The senator paused mid-sentence, startled by the unexpected interruption, and with each echoing step, the guard broke centuries of expectation. The first beat was not courage, but fear. Fear of disgrace. Fear of punishment. Fear that he had misunderstood his duty. Yet beneath that fear surged something stronger. Conviction. This was not arrogance. It was responsibility. He was not speaking for himself, but for those who could not. Each step toward the podium felt heavier than the last, as though carrying the weight of every coffin he had ever watched lowered into the ground. The hall grew tense, breaths caught in collective anticipation. What would happen when the silent sentinel finally spoke? The senator's lips parted again, but the words faltered as the guard's boots cut across the hall. The rhythm of his steps struck against marble like a slow drum beat, steady and unyielding. Each sound pulled the audience tighter into silence, until even the faint rustle of papers ceased. The guard's presence grew larger with every pace. No longer invisible, no longer a backdrop. He was the story now, and every eye bore witness. The senator's gaze narrowed with confusion, then annoyance, then unease. Protocol dictated deference, yet something in the guard's eyes made the senator shift uncomfortably. The speech in his hand trembled slightly. He attempted to continue, his voice cracking on a line that had once been rehearsed to perfection. But the words felt hollow now, fragile against the thunder of one man's resolve. The guard stopped 3 feet from the podium, rifle still in his grasp, chest heaving once with restrained breath. The crowd expected him to speak, but he did not. He did not need to. His silence, chosen rather than imposed, was louder than the senator's microphone. The marble hall had carried countless speeches, but never had it carried a pause so heavy. Children clutched their parents' sleeves, unsure of what they were seeing. Veterans leaned forward, their eyes glistening with recognition. They understood the language of sacrifice without words. The senator finally lowered his script, his jaw tightening. He cleared his throat, but no sound followed. His authority waned beneath the unwavering stare of the guard, who stood not for rebellion, but for reverence. What had once been an interruption now became revelation. There are moments when silence is not submission, but protest, when breaking rules is the only way to honor them. The climax arrived not in a shouted command, not in confrontation, but in stillness. The guard slowly raised his hand, not toward the families, seated in the front row. His palm flattened in a silent gesture of respect, a salute without movement. The crowd followed his gaze and remembered why they were there, not for politics, not for speeches, but for those whose names were etched in stone. A mother in the front row pressed her son's portrait closer and wept openly, but her tears carried gratitude, not despair. Around her, others joined quiet sobs, bowed heads, a ripple of remembrance. The senator, once the center of attention, now stood dwarfed by the moment. He closed his script, his shoulders slumping as realization struck. The words he had prepared could not measure up to the silent act that had just unfolded. He stepped back from the microphone, not dismissed by authority, but humbled by dignity. For once, a politician yielded the stage to a soldier of silence. The resolution came gently. The guard lowered his hand and returned to his post with the same measured pace. Each step back was as deliberate as his choice to move forward. By the time he resumed his stance, the hall had transformed. The audience no longer looked to the podium for inspiration. They looked to the rows of families, to the folded flags, to the memory of sacrifice. The lesson was not spoken but absorbed. Respect is not in the grandeur of speeches, but in the quiet of sincerity. As the senator left the stage without delivering his full address, applause erupted not for him, but for what the guard represented. It was not thunderous or orchestrated, but raw, uneven, carried by emotion rather than protocol. The applause was gratitude, the acknowledgement of unseen sacrifice, the echo of a nation remembering what truly mattered. The core insight lingered in the air. Sometimes the most powerful way to speak is to break silence, not with words, but with presence. Families left with tear-streaked faces but lighter hearts, knowing their grief had not been turned into performance. Veterans clasped hands, nodding to one another, comforted that their sacrifices had not been forgotten beneath political ambition. Even children, though too young to understand fully, sensed the weight of the moment and would carry it as a story worth retelling. In the epilogue, the guard's actions spread far beyond the hall. Reports emerged, videos circulated, and debates followed. Some questioned his breach of duty. Others praised his courage. Yet, regardless of opinion, the truth could not be denied. His act had reignited a conversation about honor, about the difference between ceremony and respect. Schools retold the story as a lesson in empathy. Families found in it a reminder that even institutions bound by silence could still choose humanity. For the first time in decades, he said quietly, "I felt seen." Another story emerged of a young girl who had attended the ceremony and later told her teacher, "The soldiers showed us that being brave doesn't always mean fighting." One anecdote spoke of a veteran who had been skeptical of ceremonies for years, weary of political speeches. When he saw the video of the guard stepping forward, his bitterness softened. Sometimes it means stopping. These ripples, small yet profound, carried the guard's message further than any speech could have. And so the guard returned to his silent watch, but he was never the same. He had broken protocol, yet strengthened its spirit. He had stepped forward not to stand against rules, but to remind the world why those rules existed in the first place. His silence remained, but now it was a chosen silence, a silence filled with meaning. A silence that spoke louder than the most eloquent words. The story closed with a call not to forget. To remember that respect is not measured in the grandeur of podiums, but in the quiet acknowledgement of dignity. To live with gratitude, to pause in empathy, to carry the weight of family and sacrifice with honor. The guard's lesson was simple but eternal. Sometimes one step is all it takes to remind us of the path we must never abandon. Finally, the warm call to action rang out like a soft bell. Honor those who stand silently for us. Honor those who no longer can. And honor those beside us now. Share your stories of respect, gratitude, and unseen sacrifice, so that silence will never again mean forgetting. And as the video closed, viewers were gently invited to carry forward the same respect, not only in ceremonies, but in every ordinary day that demands extraordinary compassion.